Hey, this is Tom Webster for Sounds Profitable on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. Better podcast marketing and the curiosity gap. It's one thing to use generic descriptions to explain a song or a podcast, but there's power in creating curiosity with a recommendation. First, some housekeeping. I owe you part 3 of our exploration into audio and video primes. The last couple of weeks we've covered that here on the podcast. And I promise we'll put that out next week. This week, though, a bit of an interlude about how to describe your podcast a little bit better, or at least how you hope others would describe your podcast. Last weekend, my wife Tamsin and I were doing some reading in our living room here in our tiny house in the sky in Boston, listening to a playlist that I found called Sounds Like Boards of Canada. Boards of Canada is an enigmatic Scottish electronica duo that's been integral to my music DNA since their debut, Music Has the Right to Children, was released in 1998. Tamsin came to the duo much later, thanks to the transitive property of spousing or whatever, but she too has carved out a place in her heart for the weird and wonderful universe created by the Boards. Despite her not having as long a history with the band, after about the third song on this playlist, Tamsin said, "This sounds like Boards of Canada, but isn't as good." Well, truer words have never been spoken. What makes Boards of Canada so special? Well, at least to me. How would I describe them to a friend? I suppose I'd have to give them a category like lo-fi chill or EDM or trip-hop so you could put them into a bucket. But that's just a label on a jar. You don't need to listen to Boards of Canada based on that. So let's try a different approach. Boards of Canada. It's a weird name, right? For me, though, it is precisely the key to a very particular lock. The sound of the early synth soundtracks to the warbly nature and educational films that we had to watch when I was in elementary and middle school, and many of which in my Down East Maine school system were produced by the Film Board of Canada, and now you get the name. These early electronic scores were the soundtrack to many wobbly projector films and later glitchy VHS tapes. The synths as unreliable as the film equipment in our classroom. The music, though electronic, was warm, hazy, and sepia-toned. It was imperfect, and it was perfect. When I shared this memory with Tamsin, though she was not schooled by the Film Board of Canada as I was, she got it immediately. In her words, the warm air of the projector blowing on your arm, the dust motes dancing in the light, it's a version of the 70s and early 80s that isn't infused with the Eagles or Jackson Browne. It's a different kind of nostalgia. It makes you nostalgic for something that may not have even happened. Well, if you've listened this far, aren't you at least curious about what that sounds like? I hope so if I've done my job. It's lo-fi chill electronic music is the aisle where you find things at Home Depot. It makes you nostalgic for something that didn't happen, makes you curious. This, I would submit, is what is missing from so many podcast pitches and descriptions, something that makes me curious. In practice, this means invoking something that people wish they had back, or wish they knew. It exposes a gulf that an audience would agree exists between what they know and feel now and what they would like to know or feel. It is specific. It's not general. It's a gap they have to fill, and your podcast could be how they do that. Carnegie Mellon's George Lowenstein has researched what he has called the information gap theory of curiosity and its role in our decision-making, later popularized by the Heath brothers in Made to Stick as curiosity gaps. Like my dogs, like our 2 greyhounds, people hate vacuums, gaps in what they know, and they seek to fill them to settle their brains. For our purposes, those can be gaps in knowledge, yes, but I would submit there can also be gaps in how people feel versus how they want to feel, and piquing curiosity about those gaps is just as powerful. If I tell you that Boards of Canada is down-tempo electronic music, I have created no gap. If I tell you it's music that makes you feel the warm air of the projector in your 3rd grade class on your face, there sure as hell is a gap there, and you probably want to settle that. So when I think about the Curiosity Gap and some of my favorite shows, here's where my brain goes. 20,000 Hertz. The show's description is the stories behind the world's most recognizable and interesting sounds. Well, that's pretty good. And also, if I were trying to sell a friend on listening, I wouldn't use only that language listener to listener. Instead, I might talk about Netflix's ta-dum and how it isn't a drum at all. There's a crazy good episode about what combination of household objects first made that sound. How about how so many movie trailers use the exact same sound, the boosh. And once you hear the show dissect it, you'll never watch a movie trailer the same way again. And don't you want to fill that gap? Maintenance phase. Now, you stay for the wonderful interplay between Michael and Aubrey and how they debunk junk health and fitness fads. Debunk junk, that's a fun thing to say on a podcast. But if I were telling a friend, I'd ask them if they'd ever been on a diet and it didn't work. Wouldn't it be awesome to feel like you didn't fail, but that the diet just sucked? And maintenance phase can make you feel better about that. Well, you bet. And Inside Trader Joe's. The podcast description is pretty good. Are you a Trader Joe's fan? Want to know what keeps people coming back? Hungry for all the new and exciting stuff coming to your neighborhood store? Let's go inside Trader Joe's. Well, that's good. And if I were talking to a friend about it, I'd probably pitch it like this. You ever been into a Trader Joe's? What's up with the clerks? There's this whole show that goes deep into how they always seem to have tried exactly one thing that you're buying, and it's the best salmon roulade ever. Well, you're curious, yeah? Now, I can do this for pretty much any show in my regular rotation, because a show isn't in my regular rotation if it doesn't inspire something like that. In all of these cases, my testimonials aren't describing the show as much as they are highlighting a curiosity gap. Don't you wish you knew? Don't you wish you had this? Don't you wish you could go back to that feeling? Often, this kind of description can sound arrogant or self-aggrandizing as marketing, if you say it. But it can really sing as a testimonial. Maybe you can't say it yourself, but you can highlight it when someone else says it. Or maybe encourage them to say it. And this is where the real magic can happen. Your listeners are probably already saying things like this. It's your job to listen and to shine a light on these unsolicited testimonials whenever you can, because they are literally doing a better job telling people why they should listen to your podcast than you ever could. I'm probably exposing something that the witness protection program I am part of would rather I didn't. But in a past life, I did a lot of work on the smooth jazz format around the world, something that my now 20-year-old accomplished musician son will probably someday need therapy for. What almost no one knows about smooth jazz, though, is that its very name, functionally perfect, came from a listener in Chicago during a focus group that my late mentor Frank Cody did for WNUA, New Age, in Chicago. Frank was interviewing a delightful black woman in her late 40s about how WNUA made her feel. And she just said it. She said, it's jazz, but it's like smooth jazz. Bingo. The listeners are always right. So if you're a podcaster, keep your ears wide open for these moments in conversations or social media, or even in informal listener research. When a listener doesn't just describe your show, but offers something specific and intriguing that helped them bridge a curiosity gap or made them feel a certain way. These elements are the true gold of your show and better than any marketing copy you'll ever come up with. Now, don't you want to listen to Boards of Canada? There's a link in the show notes. Thanks again for listening this week to the podcast Marketing and the Curiosity Gap. This episode is hosted on Spreaker. Thank you, Spreaker. For Sounds Profitable, I'm Tom Webster, and I'll see you next week.